Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. Today's guest is a Toronto health and medical writer who has won 6 national awards. Her latest book, Blindsight is 2020, is all about those who dissented during the COVID policy regime that we recently went through. And Gabrielle Bauer, welcome to the show.
Hi, Michael, and thanks so much for having me.
So the first question I got to ask is, why write this book?
Uh, the whole thing just developed so organically. It's almost like there wasn't a decision point. I think my reaction to the whole COVID regime, as you put it, on a soul level was so intense. I had such a visceral recoil that I felt the need to try to understand it and to connect with like-minded people. And I can go into more detail later about this, but this led me to write essays and to finally have an opportunity to publish this book. I pitched the idea to my publisher and they went for it. And then I had all this material also that I'd been gathering for these years, hundreds and hundreds of links and, and the essays as well. And then it just happened.
So the people you're talking about are the people who protested the idea of lockdowns and vaccine mandates. And I'm guessing there's some people also that were promoting alternative treatments. Would that be accurate? Like the people that, for instance, promoted ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine. So the fact that you admire their courage in speaking out, does that imply an endorsement on your part for everything that any of the dissidents had to say? I wouldn't imagine so, but I just want to make sure.
Yeah, not necessarily. I actually deliberately stayed clear of certain issues in the book because although I'm a medical writer and deal with doctors and scientists every day, I think there's people who are better positioned to talk about the evidence for and against these issues, like hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin and even vaccine side effects. I don't really spend much time at all in the book on those issues, which, as I said, are being written about a lot and studied. My book is more concerned with the sociological, philosophical implications of the policies, and that's what I explore via the experts that I feature.
Now, you write that from the beginning when the mantra, we need to follow the science, was basically ubiquitous. You didn't use that word, but it nevertheless was. I mean, I couldn't turn on the TV or listen to the radio without hearing someone tell me, follow the science, follow the science.
Yeah.
But you said that from the beginning, that seemed wrong footed to you. Like it didn't seem like a good approach to just follow the science. Why not?
Well, it's more than that. It's yes, it didn't seem like a good approach, but it also actually makes no sense on a philosophical level because science is not something that can be followed like a compass. Science gives you information. And what you do with that information depends on your value set. And I'm not the only one to have observed that, but it frustrated me at the beginning that very few people did observe it, that you can't actually follow the science. It's like philosopher David Hume's principle, the no-fee principle. You can't go from is to ought. Science is about what is, and morals and values are about what you ought to do with the information. So it really frustrated me on that basic level. And then there's another level where the statement doesn't make sense in the context of a pandemic, which is that a pandemic isn't just a scientific puzzle to solve. It's a human endeavor that involves so many dimensions, mental well-being, spiritual well-being, cultural well-being. How to shepherd the human family through this is not just about focusing on viral containment. There's so many other factors. So the people who were saying follow the science. Well, where were the economists? Where were the historians? Where were the mental health experts? You know, if we're going to bring experts at the table, we have to bring experts from all these disciplines. Otherwise, you end up with what Sunetra Gupta, who is both an epidemiologist and a novelist, called a one-dimensional response to a multi-dimensional problem. And that is, in fact, what we ended up with.
Yeah, I remember, at the beginning when they started the shutdowns and then they wanted to hand out money to everybody and say, "Oh, we're going to finance you." And I remember thinking to myself that an economist would see this and say that this is a recipe for disaster. You're artificially limiting the supply while driving up the demand and handing out free cash. This is going to lead to, what I felt was going to be an inflationary recession, or some people call it stagflation, whatever you wish to call it, which is precisely what ends up happening is you end up with a big bout of inflation, and it looks like we may be headed into a recession. And then, like you talked about, ethicists should have been involved. And I'm a big proponent of individual rights. So what about the rights of an individual not to
Exactly.
partake in your regime, not to, get a vaccine or not to wear a mask? And none of these issues were being addressed. It was as if the only consideration on the planet was physical health. And that
That is
seemed to
so true.
me, yeah, it just seemed like a big, big error. Now, do you get into any of the sort of collateral effects of these policies, the mental health or the effects on children or the effects on the economy? Like, what are your thoughts on that, on those things?
Yeah, the book definitely does. And in fact, one of the things that I chose to do, I think a little bit differently from other pandemic books, is that the people I feature are not just from the scientists. There's certainly scientists and doctors, but there are bioethicists. There are cognitive scientists. There are mental health experts. There's novelists, and there are philosophers, bioethicists. There's even a comedian and a priest, because all these people have valuable insights to bring to bear on the pandemic. So again, this idea that we should only listen to the scientists is completely absurd, because this is a global human challenge that has to be met on several levels. So yes, all these people are featured, and they all bring their own lens um, on the problem,
And
and they
there's
all deserve to
also
be heard. They're all very insightful.
and there's this idea, right, that there should be just one voice out there that everybody has to listen to, as if we're not intelligent enough to weigh different opinions. And it's funny, last week I did an interview about the different COVID responses of various countries. And the
Mm.
guy that came on was primarily discussing Sweden's response as compared to ours. And it's funny because when I logged into Spotify to look up my podcast, I noticed that above that interview, there's a little marker put down for information on COVID, as if anybody that's talking about COVID might diverge from the official line, but we're going to make sure you have the official line. Now, I'm not quibbling with Spotify's right to do that. They're a private company. If they wish to do that, that's fine. But it seems like that's been the dominant reaction from the sort of elites or the mainstream, whatever you want to call them, is that we know this is the right way to do things. But science progresses by making mistakes. You don't know at the beginning how things are going to, transpire. You make a hypothesis, maybe it's wrong, you move forward, but and that's fine with me. So if they make a mistake, I don't say, aha, before you said this. But when you present it as if you've got the absolute truth on these things and you know all things, and then it goes, different from what you're saying, it creates problems, right?
Well, absolutely. But again, that's one level of the issue, that yes, science always changes, and science is a process of testing and retesting and refining and getting close to the truth. But then there's that other level that I talked about, and that I think it's really important that even if the science were perfect, even if we knew exactly what to do to contain this virus, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily the best thing on a human level. For example, maybe the very best way to contain this virus is to have lockdowns for the next 20 years or 50 years.
Mhm.
We can all just be in our little cells and get food, served to us by robots. Maybe we'll eradicate the virus. Maybe we'll be virus free. Maybe we'll be the healthiest physically, our bodies, as ever. Does that mean it's the right way to go on a human level? No, I don't think too many people would agree to be locked down for 50 years in order to contain this virus. So again, just because something works on the epidemiological level doesn't mean it is the best response on the human level. And that's a distinction that I think got lost and that really
It did.
drove me nuts. Follow the science. Well, why? This is more than a scientific problem. And as you mentioned earlier, the only concern was to keep people physically alive, and what I call metabolic health. The idea was to preserve metabolic life. Let's keep the cells going. But what about meaningful living? What about psychological well-being? What about spiritual life, for people who are so inclined, et cetera, et cetera. So it was very, very reductive and one-dimensional response. And I think some of us are sensitive to that, and we just recoiled against it. And I don't know about you, but I was amazed to discover that I was actually in the minority. It's like, wait a minute. I thought most other people would think the same way about this. How come everyone is just follow the signs, stay home, save lives, stay home, save lives? It was a real shock to me to discover that, my views were not mainstream about this.
Right. And the peculiar thing about it to me is, first of all, like you said, health should be a part of a discussion. After all, it is a pandemic, but it's not the only thing in life that matters is staying
Exactly.
virus free. And the other thing is this, is that if I was afraid to come out of the house, I'm
Mm.
free to stay home. Or if I want to wear a mask, if I want to, wrap my face in wool, that's my choice. But people started to believe they had the right to dictate to other people what they did as well. And it just seems a recipe for disaster to me. And I mean, the divisions within society that have been revealed or enhanced by this thing, I think are tremendous. Something interesting that you wrote about is the idea of putting people into boxes. So
Mm.
first of all, explain what that means. And then I would like to have you talk about how that applies to the COVID responses on in every side, whether it be the
Yeah.
dissenters or the official people, whatever it is. How does that idea apply here?
I think we humans have a tendency to put people in boxes, for so many issues, and COVID being one of them. And, the two narratives split apart very early and stayed there on two separate tracks. There was the one side that is very pro government intervention, pro strict measures, in favor of basically everyone doing the same thing, everyone having to follow the same restrictions, and also very much in favor of vaccines and against, the early treatments. And and then the other side being basically flipped around on all these issues, um, and that doesn't take the nuances and the realities of different individuals into account at all. Like, take me for example. um, I've had several shots, the vaccines. I mean, for me personally, it wasn't a big deal either way. So many people spent so much time deliberating, should I, shouldn't I, this, that. I guess I was as casual about the vaccines as I was about COVID. I'm basically a probability type of person, and I have reasonably high risk tolerance. And my thinking, I'm 66 now, 63 when this all started, and my thinking was, they'll probably, chances are they'll help me more than they hurt me, and that's it. But given that, I was and became over time, especially after talking to bioethicists for my book, I really became opposed to the mandates on a fundamental rights level. So, yes, you can be multiply vaxxed and opposed to the vax mandates. Um, and an even funnier example that I talk about in the book and also in this article that you referenced is there was this assumption that good, caring people are going to be in favor of lockdowns. And if you're not in favor of lockdowns, well, you are not a good, caring person. And
No, you must
it's
want people to die in the streets.
exactly, especially grannies, let's
Yes, they
kill as
can't
many
breathe
grannies as
and their
possible.
lungs collapse. Yes, because you don't want to force them to take a vaccine.
That's right.
Ugh.
And it so happened that a year ago, my husband and I, just when the Ukraine war broke out, we hosted a Ukrainian woman for a couple of months. And then somebody I knew who learned about this and also knew that I was opposed to lockdowns all this time, she basically said, well, wait a minute, but I thought you were against lockdowns and you're doing something caring. So it was, like she couldn't reconcile the two, that I was doing something to help out, a person who needed a place to live, and I was opposed to lockdowns. How can this be? So again, this putting people in boxes leads to these ridiculous beliefs and contradictions. Um,
Yeah,
yeah, there's a lot of them.
for instance, I never doubted, and I don't doubt now that COVID can be a very serious virus. I think it's far more deadly and more contagious than the flu. I think the vaccinations probably help, not as much as they were promoted to in the beginning, but nevertheless, they help. I think social distancing was probably a smart thing to engage in. And at the same time, I don't think the government should have been mandating any of this. But people
Yeah.
assume once I say that I don't think the government should be mandating masks, for instance, you don't think anybody should wear a mask. Well, no, that's not what I said. Or because you don't think people should wear a mask, you must be against vaccines too. They just
Oh,
assume that
exactly.
yeah, once you're for one position, you must be for every position. This happens to me a lot. It's funny outside of here when it comes to politics because I don't fit into either Democrat or Republican box. So I'll
Yeah.
say things like, I'm against the war on drugs. I think drugs should be legal. And people say, oh, you and Joe Biden, like you must be some liberal, and I'm not. Or if I talk about taxes should be low, they say, "Oh, you must be watching Tucker Carlson again."
Yeah.
Someone actually said that to me the other day. You're getting your talking points from Tucker Carlson. I've never watched a single episode, but because I had one opinion that he probably shares, I must be in there as well.
Oh,
So
yeah, absolutely.
what are the dangers though? I mean, there are benefits to that, right? I mean, when you don't know somebody and you have to make quick decisions, there are benefits to sort of that in the box thinking, or I forget there's a word for it that's escaping my mind now, but
Well,
basically just tying
it's a
things
shorthand.
together. Yeah, it's a
It's a
heuristic,
shorthand.
right?
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly it. It's a heuristic. Well, I think we've touched on the dangers is that you can't have a real conversation with a person and you miss all the nuance that lies in between the two poles. Um, you don't appreciate the full complexity of human opinion and the variations
You
and you
basically
can't
make a
discuss it.
caricature of the other person's perspective, right? And it
Oh,
makes it much
absolutely.
easier to argue against too, because you can make somebody look ridiculous that
Hmm.
actually isn't ridiculous. So the people that you write about, they're dissenters, they're rebels, protesters, and you tell an interesting story about your daughter in another article I read. You're a very good writer, by the way. I found your articles that I read very engaging, very clear, easy to understand. So anybody watching, you should check them out because they're very informative, very good articles. But you talked about your daughter and how she didn't get the vaccine basically out of protest. She didn't think it was a harmful thing. She didn't even think it wouldn't help. She just was fed up with an environment where you're expected to conform. Now, I can relate to this. Let me tell you a short story. When COVID hit, I was incarcerated. I was in prison for a very long time, and people were fed up with everything that was going on. Now, I had been speaking out against a lot of the policies in prison. They were passing rules that they weren't following. The correctional officers weren't doing what they were supposed to do. Nothing was going the way that it was supposed to. And on top of that, we had inmates that would be throwing stuff across the tier. Food was all over the place. They were making noise all night, generally making my life very uncomfortable. The inmates were doing it just as much as the staff. And they also weren't speaking up for anything rational. It was just, I want what I want when I want it. So then one morning, they brought breakfast to the block. And the trays, they were supposed to have eggs on them, but they didn't. It's supposed to be eggs, grits, and bread and milk, but they didn't have the eggs on them. So all of a sudden, everybody in the block decided to protest, except me, because my thinking was, screw you guys. You guys make my life miserable. You haven't stood with me at all as I'm protesting against this stuff, but now you're unhappy. So you want me to speak with you. So I walked I didn't care about the breakfast one way or the other. It didn't mean a thing to me, but I just out of protest, I went and grabbed my tray. But it seems to me, and it seemed to me then, that I put myself at unnecessary risk. I could have gotten hurt and it was over nothing. So I
Mhm.
think that this idea that you want to protest can be good, but I also think it can be unnecessarily risky. But the main thing is, I think that the environment creates an incentive or a desire to do that. I think that your daughter, and this is what I want you to speak about, arrived at a place where the environment that was created by the sort of dictators, I don't like to use that word, but I don't know a better one, the dictators of how we should all be behaving, drove her to a place where she felt she had to protest. And I think that that can spread out to the wider society at large, where you end up with people just feeling like they have to protest. Would that be, in your experience, is that something you've seen or experienced? Well, I guess I already used the word experience, but you know what I mean. Is that something you've
Yeah,
come across beyond your own daughter?
definitely. and I can come back to my daughter later, but let's say with the Canadian truckers convoy, I devote a chapter in the book to, you know, to that. Um, I always felt, and one of the journalists who reported on it and who's in my book really felt as well, that this was more than about vaccine mandates. This was a generalized protest against a regime that had just, become too big for its own britches, like against massive government overreach. So the surface reason was these truckers protesting against the vaccine mandates that are preventing some of them from going across the border. But the deeper reason is that we had been, 2 years into this COVID craziness, and that needed to find some expression of protest. So yes, I do think that there's, when people are protesting against one thing, there's a deeper level as well, where they're protesting against something more general. And in the case of my daughter, I explain in the book, she's sort of a semi-professional musician. She does a lot of gigs, singing and playing piano around town, and she was just starting to find her sea legs musically when COVID came along, and doing, some very interesting songwriting. And then it was all just gone. And, she could put up with it for a couple of weeks, couple of months, 6 months, whatever. But then this whole narrative suddenly became, well, culture doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is this virus. Connecting musically doesn't matter. And she was just confused, like, wait a minute, people had always been telling me that this was so important, so such a vital part of the human experience, and now it's just canceled indefinitely. It doesn't matter anymore. No one cares. And that was frustrating to her. And she's not indifferent to the need to manage this virus, but again, just the level of insanity around it. She actually had one concert during the COVID insanity where she was locked up in a glass booth performing. It was just the most bizarre thing. There was really no connection at all with the audience. So I think she was just protesting that, and protesting the lack of a discussion about an exit ramp. How are we going to, get off this crazy train? In the end, she ended up getting the shots. I think she stopped at 3. I think she was somewhat pragmatic about it. And, perhaps she felt that she wanted to do her part. She was somewhat influenced by those messages as well. So that's where she landed. And, my son ended up stopping at 2, which I'm happy about, because he told me that he experienced some, heartbeat irregularities after the second shot. And, we know that with young men, there's some
can be
cardiac
problem,
risks.
right?
So, we're all completely fine with that and happy that he stopped. But the thing is, even at the very beginning, when I was much more pro-vaccine, and even at the very beginning, I didn't see as much the problem with the mandates. I thought, well, it's not that different from school mandates. Even then, I decided early on that I would never, ever exclude people on the basis of their vaccination status. I would never ask them about their vaccination status. I would never not socialize with someone, because that just seemed sort of a path to crazy to me. I didn't want to partake in that kind of thinking, and I remember I met a friend once happened to be April 1st, and we went for a walk outside. This was April 1st, 2022. And at one point we're walking and she bursts out crying. And I said, okay, what's going on? And she said, I was so afraid, because she was unvaccinated. She said, I was so afraid, I didn't know whether to tell you or not tell you. I just tossed and turned all night. I was afraid that if I told you, you wouldn't want to go on our walk and you wouldn't want to be friends and this and that. It's like, relax, relax. It's all fine. But just the fact that we had gotten to this point, it just seemed so ridiculous to me. And by then everyone knew that the vaccine wasn't blocking transmission. So the whole basis for the mandates had really crumbled.
Yeah, it was never going to give us herd immunity.
No.
Which is what they told us at first. So this, you talk about how on social media, people were especially vicious towards you.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So can you give me some examples and also tell us like what was the experience like for you to just be so mistreated because of
Well,
taking a different viewpoint?
well, it was a real lesson for me. I mean, I think historically I've had a pretty thin skin. I do react to, being insulted and so forth, sometimes overreact, as my husband would tell you. So I really had to develop a thick skin in a hurry, and I did to a large extent because I had no choice. But at the beginning, I felt a strong need to find a community of people that were on the same wavelength as me, that could understand why I recoiled so much against this, because I was surrounded by all these, stay home, save lives messages and all this finger wagging and snitching and all that. And I just needed to find my tribe. And so I went online, putting out feelers. Eventually, it all came together. But in the process, I mean, the insults, I mean, people called me, oh, go enjoy your sociopathy, go lick the virus, you mouth breathing Trump tard flat earther or whatever. Negative IQ, troglodyte. I mean, on and on and on and on. It was always the so-called caring side who, came forth with these insults. I couldn't help noticing that. It was unbelievable, and that's how I came to really align with Matthias Desmet's view. He's a psychologist from Belgium that I feature in the book as well, and he talks about mass formation, about how there was a psychological epidemic going on in parallel with the viral epidemic, and that people were in the grip of this. And I think, at the height of the insanity, that's exactly what was going on. People were collectively insane. I was 63 at the time. As I told you, no one had ever called me these things in all my 63 years of life, and suddenly I'm a sociopath, I'm a retard, I'm this and that and the other. It was just there was no interest in dialogue, none at all. And
No.
then, like my salvation, I remember Googling. I don't remember the exact words, but it's in April 2020. At the end of April, I Googled something like, I don't know, don't believe in lockdowns or something like that. And then what popped up, among other things, was a link to a Reddit group called Lockdown Skepticism, which is still very active today with more than 55,000 members. So I went in, I joined, and there was my community. And I eventually became a moderator for the group. I joke sometimes that I'm the oldest moderator on Reddit, but I'm one of about 10 active moderators for the group, and we have a great community, and the sub is still very active. And from there, I was able to find some people in Toronto, because this is an international community, Lockdown Skepticism, and here and there's members from Toronto. So I would take a note of it, and eventually I formed a Toronto group, which we called QLIT, Questioning Lockdowns in Toronto. And so then I suddenly had a Toronto community. We had a WhatsApp chat that at the height of it all just never slept. It went on like 3 o'clock in the morning. People would be messaging constantly. And it grew to over 100 people. We had lots of meetups. We went to some protests together. I'd never been to a protest before of any kind. Um, so again, I had to work hard to find a community, but it made all the difference. And again, then it also led to connections with some publishers and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, ultimately led to the book. But, the impetus was just a very strong psychological need to find a community. When you're surrounded by what feels like sharks, you got to do something, for my psychological survival. It was very important. My husband, to his great credit, is very tolerant. He never shamed me or anything like that, but he didn't really feel the same way as I did about all this. He was much more accepting. He's much more accepting of government. It's like, well, if government wants me to do this, I'll do it. Canadian, typical Canadian. And so, I couldn't really find my tribe, so to speak, in him regarding this issue at the time. But I think that's what happens when there's a strong psychological need for something. Well, you take action, and then it leads to certain results.
It's like when people put you in a box, they can sometimes drive you into the box. Like they put you in sort of this idea that this is how you must be, and then you actually found the community of people that were like you on this issue in a lot of ways. And people can be, I mean, they think, it seems, a lot of people, that they're an insult substitute for rational argument. I have a chipped tooth, and I've had people say to me, like, why don't you go to a dentist? And it's like, really? Like, okay. I mean, I don't know
Yeah,
what you think that's going to accomplish. Thanks for the advice.
exactly.
Like, I didn't know I have a chipped tooth, but
Yeah,
it's just,
exactly.
yeah, it's just
Exactly.
amazing how people feel that way, that if they can just insult you, or are mean enough, or can shame you enough, that it's somehow going to alter your viewpoint, instead of just trying to reason with you about things. If their position has merit, then they should be able to convince people. If it doesn't, then they won't, right? So
Exactly.
what are some lessons you think? Because I'm sure we're going to end up with another public emergency, or maybe another, it won't be a pandemic, maybe it will be. What are some lessons you would like to see taken from this and applied to the next scenario that comes about?
Well, again, this is a bit pie in the sky because I don't have much confidence that it's going to happen. But I would like to see, um, when there's an emergency, I would like to see experts from various disciplines at the table. And in fact, one of the people that I interviewed for the book, the sociologist Robert Dingwall, he was involved in pandemic response before COVID in the UK. And he talked about how the UK was really on this before the pandemic. They had, expertise, like himself, a sociologist, expertise from all these various disciplines coming together to craft pandemic policy, and recommendations. And the world looked up to the UK in this regard. This is all before COVID, for their multifaceted, multidimensional response. And for some reason, then when COVID came along, this all just got tossed out the window. So I would like to see that come back, that UK model, and I would like to see that come back globally, where when there's an emergency, we have experts from all these disciplines at the table, weighing the pros and cons, and because the scientists, they have one nail that they want to hammer down, and they have one hammer, and that's it. They just want to stamp out the virus. They're not looking at all these other dimensions, and you absolutely need to look at them. So that would probably be one important thing. And another one that comes to mind is the government's role in keeping the populace calm and rational, and which they completely abdicated with COVID. If anything, that the government and then the media that became the government's mouthpiece really seemed invested in perpetuating fear. And I devote one chapter of the book to that as well, and to an author who analyzed the government's role in perpetuating that fear. So that's very counterproductive, and I think it led to and fed into that COVID hysteria and the groupthink and the mob psychology and all that. So I would really like to see policies that mitigate against that. But then there's some more intangible, philosophical, abstract things that I would love to see happen, but that are never going to happen. I was always interested in the philosophical implications of all this. Why are we only focusing on preserving what Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben calls bare life, and what I call metabolic life? Is this the best way to, sort of deal with our presence on Earth here? And then there's also politically the whole idea of collectivism versus individualism. I thought very deeply about that, and I really saw the dangers of a rampant collectivism, and why we need to balance that. I think that there's certain people on the progressive left who just are so wedded to this idea of a completely collective response. We all have to think the same way and behave the same way and respond the same way. And ultimately, that's not sustainable, because humans are not the same. They don't think the same way. They don't bring the same resources, capabilities, or anything else to the table. In a response, that a pandemic policy that expects a uniform response is bound to fail sooner or later. And I think we need to allow for individual variation. And we're seeing it now. I'm very happy to see this now. And in fact, I have an article in Philosophical Salon that just came out today that addresses this old normal versus new normal. Looks like the old normal is ultimately winning, which is great to me. There's so many people who predicted we will never see handshakes again. We will never see people blow out candles again. Travel will change forever. People will be socially distanced on planes forever, et cetera, et cetera. All these things that would never come back. Big Christmas parties will never come back. I document all this in the article, and they were wrong on all counts. So I think what happened is people were willing to put up with it for time, but then at some point human nature kicked in. That's how I see it. I see it as a very positive thing. Some people see that as a very negative thing. Oh my God, we lost the war. We didn't just keep fighting and fighting and fighting against this virus. But for me, it's great. This is human nature asserting itself in the face of this, coercive, narrow, constricted version of life where we turn the whole world into a hospital control zone. Well, most people, it turns out, don't want that. They're even willing to take a few risks here and there in order to have a freer life. And to me, that's great. That's something to celebrate. So
well, I got to tell you, I love the idea of the individual human spirit revolting against the collective tyranny. And
yeah.
something I personally would like to see, and maybe even more pie in the sky than anything you suggested, is I wish people, not just in this context, but in all contexts, understood that there's people that can disagree with me and still be smart and still be honest. Just because they disagree with me doesn't mean they're fools and knaves, but that seems to be a sort of a common dynamic in a lot of the debates and discussions that I get into. So
that is so true. Yeah.
Before I let you go, have I forgotten anything? Is there anything else you think we should have covered, or you want to say about the topic?
Well, I think, no, I'm good. We've covered a lot of great ground. But just speaking to your last point, I find even on my side, people get into this and it annoys me. People say, well, we are right and the other side is wrong. We are the good ones and the other side is motivated by evil, evil, evil. I really try to avoid that. Because ultimately, I don't believe it. I don't believe the other side is evil. I believe that they have a certain worldview that doesn't really vibe with me and that I think is problematic in some ways. And my articles and book are attempts to explain why, but I don't think they're evil. They just have a different view of the kind of world they want to live in. They want a world that is more homogeneous, that is more, where physical safety plays a more central role. That is their worldview. A lot of us reject it, and we have our reasons, and let's talk about them. But yeah, I don't like this sort of good versus evil epic narrative that we all, are vulnerable to falling into.
Me neither. Okay, so where can people find you? Where can people get your book?
Well, I'll sort of show a picture of the book. The book can be found on Amazon, Lulu, soon to be available in audiobook. If anyone wants to go to the Brownstone Institute, they can find more information about me and the book. Here it is. Blindsight is 2020.
Okay.
So yeah, it can be ordered very easily. It's been shipped all over the world via Amazon, and as I said, for Amazon haters, on Lulu, an audiobook is currently in the works, and it's also available in Spanish for Spanish speakers. There's a Spanish publisher who put it out. A ciegas en 2020. So yeah, so it's been a great ride, and I do hope that people read it. And I made a promise to myself right at the beginning that anyone who sends me personal feedback, whether good or bad, is getting a personal response and good discussion.
Okay.
I intend to keep that.
All right, Gabrielle Bauer, thank you very much for being here. For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing off. Remember, like, share, comment, subscribe. Till next time.